Welcome to your flipped classroom. The topic for today's lecture is the 18th century government, society, and economy in the Qing Dynasty. The 18th century was generally a time of prosperity, when institutions functioned as smoothly as they ever had. State and society formed a continuum. Both the local elite and the government officials were products of the civil service exam. Thus, they shared a broad spectrum of values and ideas, inducing them to cooperate rather than to compete and to work in harmony rather than conflict. This is in contrast to other world societies where the elite are often vocal critics of the government. Two examples of this cooperation between government and local elites are granaries and education. During the 18th century, there existed granaries to store grain in almost every county. This grain would then be used in times of famine or to keep prices affordable. In wealthy regions, corporate lineages would construct and maintain granaries. Corporate lineages are kinship groups whose members often live, work, play, and pray together. Property is controlled by the group, people derive their primary identity from the group, and even religion, in the form of ancestor worship, is a lineage matter. Acting like a small corporation, the lineage has a powerful impact on the everyday lives of its members. In other areas, the state operated granaries, known as ever-normal granaries, to ensure not only an adequate supply of grain in all parts of its domain, but also a stable and affordable price in local markets. The state would buy up surplus grain on local markets when the price was at its lowest after the fall harvest, and sell this same grain when local markets supplies were scarce in late winter and early spring. The state's concern for upholding popular morality was expressed in the promotion of village lectures. Here also the state relied on the local elite. Twice a month, the local elite staged a ceremony with the recitation of the sacred edict for all people in the village. The sacred edict was first instituted by the Kangxi Emperor, but expanded and given definite form by the Yongjung Emperor. The sacred edict consisted of 16 moral maxims. A few examples are: 1. Esteem most highly filial piety and brotherly submission, in order to give due importance to human moral relations. 2. Behave with generosity toward your kindred, in order to illustrate harmony and benignity. 3. Cultivate peace and concord in your neighborhoods, in order to prevent quarrels and litigations. For a complete copy of the Sacred Edict, please download the handout located in the online folder. Much effort was made to popularize the edicts through lectures in the vernacular, the telling of moral tales, and conducting of dramatic performances to illustrate the main points of the instruction. Schools were also often left to local initiative. However, in outlying areas, government would take a more active role. For example, one governor in Yunnan province established more than 650 schools for the minority people living there. During the first 40 years of the Qing Dynasty, due to warfare, destruction, dislocation, and even cold weather, there was widespread famine, disease, and population decline. However, both the economy and population revived and went on to reach new heights. By the end of the 18th century, population reached around 300 million. More people now lived in China than in Europe. Though there were beginning to be signs of overpopulation, population growth at this time was not yet a problem. In fact, there was an increase in life expectancy and living standards compared favorably to Europe at the time. Several factors contributed to this population growth. Most significantly, there was an increase in agricultural yield. This was due to a number of factors, including 1. Specialized strains of rice that grew better in local conditions. 2. Improved irrigation techniques, as well as better fertilizers, such as soybean cakes. 3. Introduction of new world crops, such as sweet potatoes and peanuts, and finally 4, an extended growing season. Other factors that contributed to population growth also included the slowing of disease during peacetime and the efficiency of government relief, such as the ever-normal granaries that sustained people in times of famine. Now that people had an increase in agricultural yield, commercialization soon followed. People now had a surplus. This means they could sell their surplus grain on the open market or use that land to grow other commercial crops. Farmers began to grow cash crops to sell, such as tea, sugar, cotton, hemp, tobacco, and mulberry trees for feeding silkworms. Manufacturing also expanded during this time. Chinese ceramics and porcelains were world famous and would be copied in Japan and Europe. Indeed, even today, the common word for ceramic flatware is China. Brewing, papermaking, mining, and metalworking all thrived. In fact, China led the world in silk and cotton production. Until the 1770s, Chinese vessels predominated both the coastal trade and in foreign trade. Throughout the 18th century, the balance of trade was in China's favor. In other words, China had lots of products the Europeans wanted to buy, but Europe had little that interested the Chinese. Thus, the Europeans had to pay for Chinese goods with silver. Silver flowed into the Chinese economy from Japan and the Spanish colonies in the New World. Growth in manufacturing and trade led to market towns where merchants would buy and sell agricultural produce, manufactured goods, and handicraft items. This was fostered and serviced by a sophisticated banking system and water transport system that created a national market. As China increased in prosperity, the market often prevailed over traditional status. Merchants, lowest on the Confucian status scale, often enjoyed more luxury than those at the top of society. It also produced a striking gap between rich and poor. Within a time period paralleling the early modern period in the West, the Qing society experienced many small and not so small changes that amounted to a structural transformation. By the fall of the dynasty in 1911, China was a different society from the one the Manchus found in the mid-17th century. Social changes were felt in the exam system, gender roles, and in the traditional family. As discussed earlier, the civil service exam was the primary method of selecting scholars for government service. It also served as a marker of status. Passers of the exam enjoyed higher status whether they held government office or not. Thus, the exam was extremely important in traditional Chinese society. By the Qing, however, problems emerged. There were always far more exam candidates than there were government offices. The government's answer to this was to increase the number of exams required to take government office and to place quotas on the number of exam passers. Thus, regardless of how well a candidate was prepared or qualified, his chances of success were increasingly small. By this time, the criteria for grading the exams had become highly formalistic. Candidates were required to write a highly complex and artificial style known as the eight-legged essay. The eight-legged essay was formulated around a rigid, artificial structure and tested, among other things, the examinee's knowledge of the 4 books and the 5 classics, and the ability to insert classical allusions and idioms at the places deemed appropriate. It was so named because it was divided into 8 formulaic sections. Given the pressures to succeed and one's limited chances, this caused people to look for ways to cheat, and in fact some even went crazy. There are even lots of ghost stories associated with the examination hall. The cultural idea in traditional Chinese society is a multi-generational extended family, with the ultimate goal being, quote, the 5 generations under one roof. This ideal, however, was difficult enough to achieve under prosperous conditions, and nearly impossible for the average commoner. The interior world of the household, known as the inner quarters, was regarded as the woman's sphere. Marriages were almost always arranged, and the bride would move in with the groom's family. This is known as patrilocal marriages. This often led to significant conflict between the bride and the mother-in-law. However, once she gave birth, preferably to a boy, her status would raise in the family. During the late Ming, women enjoyed substantial rights, and the idea of a love marriage became increasingly acceptable. However, with the collapse of the Ming, Confucian scholars concluded that the Ming fell due to moral laxity. For a brief period of time, there was a conservative turn. Prostitution, homosexuality, and even the theater were proscribed. Of more lasting duration, however, women were systematically subjected to many restraints in a Confucian moral system. For example, they were more likely to suffer infanticide, they were severed from their natal family at marriage and became effectively the property of their husband's household. Their rights of inheritance and property ownership were severely restricted, and they were confined to the inner quarters of their homes and denied mobility and sociability. One particular example of the restrictions placed on women is known as the cult of widow chastity. Women who refused to remarry after their husband's death were lionized as far back as the Qing Dynasty. A famous Neo-Confucian philosopher said, quote, "It would be better for a widow to starve to death rather than to remarry." Viewing widow chastity as a symbol for all other relationships of devout filiality, including loyalty to the throne, the Qing court launched a program to bestow honors on those families who resisted the temptation to sell off their widowed daughters-in-law. The practice of child or early adolescent betrothal, combined with a high incidence of early mortality, added up to a significant population of young women who found themselves widowed. These young women had already moved into their husband's parental household prior to his death. In some cases, girls might find themselves widows before the marriage had even been consummated. These young girls would then be forced to live lives of celibate loneliness, or in more extreme cases were forced or encouraged to commit suicide. The reign of the Qianlong Emperor marked the high water mark of the Qing Dynasty. After his reign, the dynasty began to decline. Rapid expansion put severe pressure on the treasury, making it difficult to pay the bannermen and provide relief for the peasants. The end of the Qianlong reign was marked by corruption and internal rebellion. Though many government officials were guilty of graft and corruption, perhaps the most notorious was He Shun. For reasons unknown, He Shun, a bannerman who served as a humble palace guard, became the favorite of the Qianlong emperor and was allowed to monopolize government posts and oppress the people. He Shun systematically turned the emperor's favor into his own fortune. Within a year, He Shun had assumed the highest ministerial positions in the empire and had gained control of the disbursement of revenue and the recruitment of personnel. His son was even married to the emperor's youngest and favorite daughter. Through elaborate patronage networks, whose protection was guaranteed by his personal hold over the emperor, He Shun orchestrated systematic embezzlement at all levels of the Qing administration. Virtually no official appointment was made without a contribution to one of He Shun's henchmen. Unsurprisingly, fewer and fewer of the critical tasks of government actually got done. When the White Lotus Society revolted in central and western China in 1796, He Shun was put in charge of suppressing the rebels. Together with several of his friends, he prolonged the campaign and channeled much of the money for the war effort into their own pockets. As a result, the troops took to looting the populace, and the authority of the dynasty was severely undermined. With the death of the Qianlong emperor in 1799, He Shun and his circle was finally removed from power. He Shun was arrested and forced to commit suicide. By his death, his personal estate was said to have amounted to some 800 million silver taels, or more than half of the total imperial revenues collected during his 20-year ascendancy. The concrete effects of decades of corruption and maladministration were increasingly visible and severe. One consequence was the large-scale uprising between 1796 and 1804 in the mountainous regions of central China known as the White Lotus Rebellion. The White Lotus Society was a religious cult already in existence in the 13th century. When the Manchu tribes of Manchuria conquered China 400 years later in the 17th century and proclaimed the Qing Dynasty, the White Lotus members dedicated themselves to the overthrow of the alien Manchus and to return of the previous Ming Dynasty. In the late 18th century, in response to famine, crowded conditions, and exploitative taxes levied on the local population by the corrupt officials of He Shun, White Lotus leaders in central China began a rebellion. They promised their followers there would be a return of the Maitreya Buddha and the end of suffering. This is known as a millenarian movement, in other words, a religious cult that looks forward to some future return of deity. Although the rebellion continued for 9 years, it never became an organized attempt to establish a new dynasty. Rather, it consisted of uncoordinated, roving bands using hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. Vast sums of money earmarked for the campaign against the rebels, however, were embezzled by the imperial favorite He Shun and his friends, as already mentioned. Instead of putting down the rebellion, the military establishment kept the war going long after it could have ended in order to profit from funds allocated to local militia units. By the last years of the so-called rebellion, most genuine sectarians had been dispersed, and the militia units on either side that continued to fight each other were both financed by the Qing state. Not until the Qianlong emperor died in 1799 was He Shun removed and the war really prosecuted. The White Lotus Rebellion was a multifaceted disaster from which the Qing never fully recovered. The impact on the government finances was dramatic. The cost of suppressing the rebellion was been estimated at 120 million taels of silver, which more than wiped out the imperial treasury. This had a devastating and permanent effect on the capacities of the Qing administration at all levels for the remaining century of imperial rule.